He wasn't supposed to step outside that night. Not when the radio kept repeating the same warning like a prayer no one could ignore. Stay indoors, roads closed, whiteout conditions, temperatures dropping below zero. But some decisions aren't made by logic. They're made by something quieter, something that remembers what it feels like to lose someone and never get the chance to try again. And Daniel Hayes had lived with that silence for years, the kind that crept in during the coldest hours, before dawn, the kind that whispered names he couldn't forget. So when the wind began to rise and rattle the thin windows of his small rented cabin on the edge of town, he didn't move at first. He just sat there with a chipped mug warming his hands, watching the snow gather like ash across the glass, each flake another layer between him and the world outside, until Rex lifted his head, slow and deliberate, ears twitching towards something Daniel couldn't hear yet. Not the wind, not the storm. Something else, something alive. The dog stood, muscles tightening under his thick sable coat, and let out a low, steady breath that fogged the air. Then he walked to the door and stopped, not barking, not panicking, just waiting. And that was what made Daniel look up, really look, because Rex didn't react without reason, not like that, not with that stillness. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured, his voice rough from disuse, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who spoke more to memories than people. Rex didn't turn, didn't break his gaze from the storm beyond the door, and for a moment Daniel felt it too, something pressing against the edges of the night, something hidden beneath the howl of the blizzard. He stood slowly, joints stiff from years of hard work and harder thoughts, crossing the room in 3 quiet steps, the floorboards creaking under his weight. And when he reached the door, the cold slipped through the cracks like a warning, sharp and immediate, biting at his skin. He hesitated there, hand hovering over the handle, because he knew what was waiting on the other side. Miles of nothing but wind and white, and the kind of cold that didn't just freeze your body, it erased you. Out there, mistakes weren't forgiven, they were buried, and for a second, just 1 second, he almost stepped back, almost let the night keep whatever it was calling from beyond the storm. But then Rex shifted, just enough for Daniel to see his eyes, amber and steady, not afraid, not uncertain, just sure. And something in Daniel's chest tightened, something old and unfinished, a memory of another cold place, another night where he had hesitated too long. He swallowed hard, fingers finally closing around the handle, the metal freezing against his skin. "All right," he whispered, more to himself than the dog. "We take a look, that's all." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't just a look. It never was. He pulled the door open, and the storm answered immediately, a wall of wind and snow crashing into him, stealing his breath, blinding his eyes. The world outside reduced to nothing but motion and noise, and somewhere in that chaos, unseen, unheard, someone was waiting, and this time, he wasn't going to be too late. The cold hit him like a living thing the moment he stepped beyond the threshold, sharp and immediate, filling his lungs with air that felt too thin to hold, and for a second his body resisted, muscles tightening as if to pull him back inside. But Rex moved first, pushing forward into the storm with a certainty that cut through the chaos, his form quickly becoming a shadow against the swirling white, and Daniel followed, forcing 1 step, then another, boots sinking deep into snow that had already climbed past his ankles and kept rising with every gust. The wind howled across the open land like something searching, something restless, and visibility dropped to barely a few feet. The world reduced to shifting shapes and the constant sting of ice against exposed skin. Daniel pulled his jacket tighter, lowering his head as he moved, keeping his eyes locked on the faint outline of Rex ahead. The dog did not run, did not panic. He moved with purpose, nose low, weaving slightly as if following a thread only he could see. And that alone kept Daniel going, because without Rex there would be no direction, no sense of where to place the next step, only the endless white that erased everything, time, distance, even thought. "Easy, boy," Daniel called out, though his voice was swallowed instantly by the wind, and still Rex pressed on, pausing only once to look back, just long enough to make sure Daniel was still there, still following, then continuing forward into the storm as if he had already made the decision for both of them. Minutes stretched, or maybe it was longer. Daniel could not tell anymore. The cold began to creep deeper, past his jacket, past his skin, settling into his bones with a slow, steady weight. And with it came something else, something familiar. The memory of another storm. Another night when the world had looked just like this, endless white, endless noise, and a voice over the radio that had cut out too soon. He blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. One step at a time. That was all that mattered now. One more step, then another, until Rex suddenly stopped, so abruptly that Daniel nearly stumbled into him. The dog stood rigid, ears forward, body tense in a way that was different from before, not searching anymore, but finding. Daniel's breath caught as he moved closer, squinting through the blur of snow. At first there was nothing, just another mound, another uneven rise in the ground shaped by the wind. But then he saw it, something unnatural beneath the snow, a faint curve of metal, barely visible, half buried, and already disappearing under fresh layers, a vehicle, or what was left of one. Daniel dropped to his knees without thinking, hands immediately digging through the snow, the cold biting into his fingers even through his gloves, each movement slower than it should have been, as if the storm itself was pushing back, resisting every attempt to uncover what it had claimed. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, not sure if he was speaking to himself, to Rex, or to whoever might be beneath the drift. Rex moved beside him, paws working quickly, clearing snow with an urgency that matched Daniel's own, and together they carved out just enough space to reveal the edge of a door, dented, frozen shut. Daniel pressed his shoulder against it. Once, twice, the metal groaning but not giving. The wind screamed louder around them, as if warning them to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But Daniel set his jaw, breath coming harder now, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something that refused to let him walk away again. He stepped back, then drove his shoulder forward with everything he had left, and this time the door shifted, just enough to break the seal, a narrow gap opening into darkness, and from inside, faint, barely there, a sound, not the wind, not the storm, something human, something fragile, and Daniel felt it hit him all at once, the weight of what he had found, the truth he could not ignore. They were not alone out here, and whatever time remained was slipping away with every second. The sound was so faint it almost disappeared between the gusts of wind, a fragile thread of life barely holding on. And for a moment Daniel froze, his breath caught somewhere between relief and fear, because finding them was one thing, getting them out was something else entirely. He leaned closer to the narrow opening, forcing his eyes to adjust to the dim interior of the vehicle. And what he saw made his chest tighten in a way he had not felt in years. An elderly man slumped forward against the steering wheel, unmoving but not gone, and beside him a woman, her head tilted slightly toward the window, her eyes half closed, her lips parted just enough to release that weak, trembling breath that had reached him through the storm. "Hey," Daniel called out, his voice steadier now, louder, cutting through the cold air. "Can you hear me?" The woman's eyelids fluttered, barely, but it was enough to tell him she was still there, still fighting in the quiet way that some people do, without noise, without panic, just holding on one breath at a time. Rex pushed his head through the gap, whining softly, his presence filling the small space with warmth and something else, something grounding, the kind of presence that made fear step back just a little. Daniel worked his hands along the edge of the door, forcing it open wider inch by inch, the metal resisting at first, frozen stiff by the storm, until finally it gave way with a dull, stubborn shift, cold air rushing inside as if the blizzard itself was trying to claim what was left. "We are getting you out," Daniel said, not asking, not hesitating, because hesitation had already cost him once before, and he would not let it cost him again. He reached for the woman first, his movements careful but urgent, brushing snow from her coat, checking for any response. Her hand moved weakly against his arm, a small, fragile motion that carried more weight than anything she could have said. "That is it," he murmured. "Stay with me." He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her slowly from the seat, her body light in a way that told him how much the cold had already taken. And for a second the wind surged harder, pushing against him as he turned away from the vehicle, snow biting at his face, his vision narrowing. But he held on, adjusting his grip, pulling her close to his chest to shield her from the worst of it. Rex stayed beside the open door, refusing to leave, his attention fixed on the man still inside. And Daniel understood without words. "I know," he said under his breath, lowering the woman gently onto a patch of cleared ground just long enough to reposition. "I am coming back for him." The promise hung in the air, carried away almost instantly by the storm. But it was real. It mattered, because promises were the only thing that kept men like him moving forward when everything else told them to stop. He turned back to the vehicle, forcing himself through the wind again, each step heavier than the last, the cold now deeper, sharper, clawing its way into his muscles. But he ignored it, focusing only on the man, reaching in, checking for breath. There it was, faint but steady, another life still holding on. "You are not staying here," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to the man, as he worked to free him from the seat, the fabric stiff, the movement slow, every second stretching longer than it should, until finally he managed to pull him forward, guiding him out into the storm. Rex immediately pressed close, his body leaning into the man's side as if lending him strength. And for a brief moment, standing there between the buried vehicle and the endless white, Daniel felt the full weight of what he was about to attempt. 3 lives against a storm that did not care, a distance back to the cabin that felt longer now than it ever had before, and a body that was already beginning to fail him in small, quiet ways. But he did not look back. He did not second guess, because some choices, once made, carried you forward whether you were ready or not. And as he adjusted his hold, securing both the woman in his arms and the man supported by Rex at his side, he took the first step into the white again, knowing this was the part where survival stopped being about strength and started being about will. The wind did not ease as they turned away from the buried vehicle. It grew louder, as if aware that something had been taken from it, and Daniel felt the resistance in every step, snow dragging at his boots, the cold pressing tighter around his chest, making each breath shorter than the last. But he kept moving, one foot forward, then the next, holding the woman close against him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, her breath shallow but still there, still fighting, while Rex stayed close at his side, steady and unyielding, guiding the elderly man who leaned heavily against him, the dog adjusting his pace with quiet intelligence, never pulling too fast, never letting the man slip too far. The 3 of them bound together in a fragile line against the storm, and for a while there was nothing but movement, no thoughts, no memories, just the rhythm of survival. Step, breathe, until the cold began to shift into something else, something deeper, a heaviness that crept into Daniel's arms, making them tremble under the weight he carried, his fingers stiffening despite the gloves, his shoulders tightening as if they were slowly turning to stone. He knew this feeling, had seen it before, men slowing down without realizing it, their bodies giving up in quiet ways long before their minds accepted it. "Not now," he muttered under his breath, forcing his grip tighter, adjusting the woman's position to keep her closer, to keep her shielded from the wind that cut across them in sharp, relentless waves. Rex glanced back once, his eyes catching Daniel's, a brief moment of silent understanding passing between them, and then he moved forward again, leading, always leading, as if he could see something beyond the storm that Daniel could not yet reach. The world around them blurred into a single, endless white. No landmarks, no edges, just the constant motion of snow driven sideways by the wind. And Daniel realized with a quiet certainty that they could no longer see the path they had come from. The cabin was somewhere ahead. It had to be, but distance meant nothing out here, not in a storm like this, where 10 yards could feel like a mile and a mile could disappear entirely. He focused on Rex, on the steady movement of the dog's body, trusting that instinct more than his own fading sense of direction. And then it happened, small at first, almost unnoticeable. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, a slight shift in the ground. But it was enough. His balance broke. His knee dropped hard into the drift, and for a moment everything tilted, the woman's weight pulling him forward, the wind pushing him sideways, the world spinning into a blur of white and pressure. He tightened his hold, refusing to let her fall, forcing himself upright again with a strained breath. But the effort took something from him, something he could not quite name, and when he stood fully again, his vision dimmed at the edges, a faint shadow creeping in, Stay with me, he said, though. He was not sure if he meant her or himself. Rex stopped ahead, turning fully this time, his posture firm, waiting, not moving until Daniel took another step, then another, and slowly the rhythm returned, fragile but present, the storm still howling, the cold still pressing in. But there was something else now, something just beyond the edge of sight, a darker shape breaking through the white, faint at first, then clearer with each step, the outline of a structure, low and steady against the wind. Daniel blinked, forcing his eyes to focus. And there it was, the cabin, barely visible through the storm but real, solid, close enough now that hope returned in a sharp, almost painful rush. His steps quickened despite the weight, despite the cold, driven by the sight of something that meant warmth, meant shelter, meant survival. And Rex moved faster too, guiding the man forward with renewed urgency, until at last they reached the door, the wood rattling under the force of the wind, and Daniel shifted his grip just enough to reach for the handle, his hand trembling as it closed around it, the metal biting cold even through his glove. And with one final push, he pulled the door open, the storm roaring behind them as they crossed the threshold, carrying with them not just 3 lives, but the thin, fragile line that had kept them all from disappearing into the white. The door slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, cutting off the roar of the storm like a switch flipped in another world. And for a moment there was only silence, thick and unfamiliar, broken only by the sound of labored breathing and the faint creak of the cabin settling against the wind. Daniel stood there frozen, not from the cold anymore, but from the sudden shift, the weight in his arms still very real, the woman's breath brushing faintly against his neck, fragile but present, and Rex moving beside him with quiet urgency, guiding the elderly man forward onto the worn wooden floor, away from the draft that slipped under the door. Easy, Daniel whispered, lowering the woman carefully onto a thin rug near the small wood stove, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if the danger outside had sharpened every instinct inside. He turned immediately, helping the man down beside her, propping him gently against the wall, their bodies still cold, still carrying the storm with them. And for a second Daniel just knelt there, his hands hovering as if unsure where to begin, until training took over, not the kind written in manuals, but the kind learned in moments where hesitation meant loss. He moved quickly to the stove, hands shaking as he struck a match, the small flame flickering uncertainly before catching, then another, and another, feeding it with dry wood stacked carefully nearby. The fire grew slowly at first, a weak glow pushing back the cold in inches rather than waves, but it was enough to start, enough to fight back. He grabbed an old blanket from a chair, wrapping it around the woman's shoulders, tucking it close to hold in what little warmth remained. Rex pressed himself against the man's side, his thick coat rising and falling with steady breaths, offering heat without hesitation, without question, and Daniel felt something shift in the room, not just temperature, but presence, the quiet kind that comes when survival begins to take hold. He reached for a small kettle, filling it with water from a metal jug, setting it near the fire, the simple act grounding him, giving his hands something to do while his mind caught up with what they had just endured. The woman stirred slightly, a faint movement under the blanket, her eyes opening just enough to find him, confused at first, then softening with recognition that did not come from knowing his name, but from understanding what he had done. Her lips parted, a whisper barely forming. "You came." Daniel nodded once, not trusting his voice yet, because something in his chest had tightened, something he had kept buried for too long. The man beside her shifted as well, his breath deeper now, steadier, and Rex remained still, watchful, his presence unwavering, as if he understood that this part mattered just as much as the storm. Daniel sat back on his heels, the exhaustion finally catching up to him in a slow, creeping wave, his arms heavy, his shoulders aching, his hands still trembling from cold that had not fully left his body. But he stayed alert, watching them, listening, making sure each breath came a little easier than the last. The fire crackled softly, its light flickering across the small room, casting shadows that moved gently instead of violently. And for the first time since stepping into the storm, Daniel allowed himself to breathe without forcing it. A deep, steady breath that filled his lungs fully, the kind he had not taken in a long time. And as he sat there between the fading storm outside and the fragile warmth growing inside, he realized something quiet but undeniable. They had made it back, not by strength alone, not by chance, but by a choice that had carried all of them through the worst of the night. And in that small cabin, with the wind still howling beyond the walls, something unseen had shifted, something that felt less like survival and more like a second chance. The fire grew stronger by degrees, not in a rush, not in a blaze, but in a steady, patient way that felt almost deliberate, like it understood that healing did not come all at once. And Daniel watched it for a moment longer than he needed to, his eyes fixed on the slow dance of orange light across the logs, because it was easier than looking at his own hands, still trembling, still not entirely his. The cold had settled deep, and though the cabin held warmth now, his body had not yet accepted it. His fingers moved stiffly as he reached for the kettle, the faint rattle of metal against metal echoing softly in the quiet room. Rex shifted slightly, but did not leave his place. His body pressed firmly against the elderly man, sharing heat without hesitation, without any expectation in return, and the man, Walter, stirred again, his eyes opening this time with more awareness, confusion flickering at first, then grounding as he took in the room, the fire, the dog beside him, and finally Daniel, sitting just a few feet away, where his voice came out thin, fragile, like something unused for too long. Daniel leaned forward slightly, keeping his tone low, steady. "You are safe," he said, the words simple, but carrying weight that filled the space between them. Walter blinked slowly, his gaze shifting toward the woman beside him, Margaret, whose breathing had grown more even, her face no longer as pale under the flicker of firelight, and something in his expression softened, not relief exactly, but recognition, the quiet understanding that they had been given more time. The kettle began to hum softly, a small, steady sound that cut through the silence, and Daniel moved to pour the water into a chipped mug, his movements still careful, controlled, as if too much speed might break the fragile calm that had settled over the room. He added a pinch of something from a small tin, herbs, simple and practical, the kind used more for comfort than cure, and brought the cup over to Margaret, guiding it gently toward her hands. "Slow," he murmured, watching as her fingers curled weakly around the warmth, her eyes meeting his again, clearer now, searching not for answers but for something deeper, something harder to name, gratitude perhaps, or something close to it. But she did not speak, she only nodded faintly, and in that small gesture there was more meaning than words could have carried. Daniel sat back again, the effort of even these small actions beginning to weigh on him, his shoulders dropping slightly, his breath slowing, but the exhaustion did not come with peace, not fully, because beneath it, something else stirred, something older, something tied to another night, another storm, another moment where he had not moved fast enough, where hesitation had taken something he could never get back. He closed his eyes briefly, the memory pressing in, the sound of wind, the silence that followed, the empty space where a voice should have been, and for a second, just a second, he felt it again, that same cold, not the kind that lived in the air, but the kind that settled inside a man when he carried regret too long. Rex shifted then, just enough to brush against his knee, a simple movement, almost nothing, but it pulled Daniel back, grounded him in the present, in the warmth of the cabin, in the steady breathing of the two people beside him, alive, still here, not lost to the storm. And he exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just a fraction. "You found us," Walter said quietly after a moment, his voice steadier now, his eyes fixed on Daniel with a kind of clarity that came not from strength, but from understanding exactly how close they had come to disappearing. Daniel shook his head once, glancing briefly at Rex. "He did," he replied, his voice soft but certain, and Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound, his ears twitching, as if acknowledging the truth without needing praise. Walter followed Daniel's gaze, his eyes resting on the dog for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his expression, something deeper than simple gratitude, something that lingered, as if he was seeing more than just what was in front of him. And the fire continued to crackle, steady and warm, pushing back the cold inch by inch, while outside the storm still howled, relentless and indifferent. But inside, in that small, worn cabin, time seemed to slow, to stretch, giving space for breath, for warmth, for the quiet realization that sometimes survival was not loud, not dramatic, but soft, almost unnoticed, like a hand reaching out in the dark and finding another still there. The night did not pass all at once. It unfolded slowly, measured in breaths and small movements, in the soft crackle of firewood and the quiet shifting of bodies finding their way back from the edge. And Daniel remained where he was, seated close enough to the stove to feel its warmth, but not so close that it chased away the cold still lingering in his bones, his eyes moving between Margaret and Walter, watching for any sign that the fragile balance might tip again. But instead he saw something else begin to take hold, color returning faintly to their faces, their breathing no longer shallow and uncertain, but deeper, steadier, as if the room itself was giving them back what the storm had tried to take. Rex eventually eased his weight, settling onto the floor beside Walter, though he never fully relaxed, his ears still tuned to every shift in the room, every subtle change, as if guarding not just their bodies, but the moment itself. And outside, the wind continued to press against the walls, a constant reminder of how thin the line had been, how easily this night could have ended differently. Walter spoke again after a long silence, his voice carrying more strength now, though still quiet. "I thought we would not make it," he said, not as a complaint, not even as fear, but as a simple truth, one acknowledged without resistance. Daniel did not answer right away, his gaze lowering briefly to the floorboards, worn and scratched from years of use, before lifting again. "Most people would not have gone out," Walter added, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in curiosity, as if trying to understand something that did not quite fit into the world he knew. Daniel exhaled slowly, the question settling somewhere deeper than words, and for a moment it seemed like he might leave it unanswered, let the silence carry it away. But then he spoke, his voice low, almost distant. "I did not go out for most people," he said, and the room held that sentence in a quiet stillness. Margaret turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes clearer now, searching his face not for explanation, but for meaning. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the fire, watching the flames move in slow, steady patterns. "There was a time," he continued, each word measured, "when I waited too long." He did not say where, he did not say when, but the weight of it settled into the space between them, heavy and unspoken. "I thought I had more time. I thought I could get there before it mattered." His jaw tightened slightly, just enough to show the effort it took to continue. "I was wrong." The words were simple, but they carried years inside them, years of silence, of remembering, of living with something that could not be changed. Walter listened without interruption, his expression steady, not offering comfort, not offering judgment, just presence, the kind that allowed a man to speak without needing to be fixed. Margaret reached out slowly, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the blanket between them, not quite touching Daniel, but close enough to be felt, a quiet acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing less. Rex lifted his head then, his eyes moving from one to the other, as if following the current of something deeper than sound, and Daniel felt it again, that shift, subtle but real. The past loosening its hold just enough to let something else take its place. Not relief, not yet, but something like it, something that felt less like weight and more like space. "Tonight was different," Walter said after a moment, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained. Daniel glanced at him, then at Rex, and gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said, almost to himself. It was. The fire continued to burn, steady and patient, filling the cabin with a warmth that reached further now, not just into their hands and faces, but into something deeper, something unseen, and outside. The storm began to shift, not ending, not yet, but changing, the wind easing just enough to sound less like a warning and more like a passing thing. And inside, in that small space held together by wood and will, 3 people and 1 dog sat in the quiet aftermath of a night that had tested everything, and somehow, without noise, without spectacle, had given something back. Morning did not arrive with color at first. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, a soft gray light pressing gently against the frost-covered windows. The storm outside no longer roaring but whispering. Its anger spent somewhere in the long hours of the night. And inside the cabin the fire had burned low to a steady glow, casting a warm, amber hush across the room where Daniel still sat, though his posture had softened. His body finally giving in to the weight of exhaustion, his head tilted slightly forward, eyes half closed but never fully asleep, as if some part of him refused to let go completely. Rex lay stretched along the floor near the door, his chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths, but his ears still alert, tuned to every shift in the room, every subtle change in sound. And Walter was the first to move, a slow inhale, deeper than before, followed by the careful lifting of his hand. As if testing whether the world would still respond, his fingers curled, then relaxed, and a faint breath of something like wonder passed through him. "We made it," he said, not loudly, not with celebration, but with a quiet disbelief that carried more weight than any shout. Margaret turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes open now, clear, reflecting the dim light of the fire, and she reached for his hand without hesitation, their fingers meeting in a way that spoke of years, of shared days and silent understandings, of a bond that had not broken even when the storm had tried to take everything else. Daniel heard them, though he did not move right away, their voices reaching him like something distant, something peaceful, and when he finally opened his eyes fully, it was not with urgency, but with a calm that had not been there before. He looked at them for a long moment, taking in the simple truth of it. They were here, alive, breathing, not a memory, not a regret, but something real he could see and touch, and that realization settled into him slowly, like warmth returning to a place that had been cold for too long. Walter shifted carefully, pushing himself up just enough to sit straighter, his gaze moving toward Daniel with a new clarity, not just gratitude now, but recognition of something deeper, something that could not be repaid in the usual ways. "You changed the ending," he said quietly, and Daniel frowned slightly, not understanding at first. Walter continued, his voice steady. "Most stories like this do not end with people sitting by a fire." He glanced briefly at Margaret, then back again. "But you did not walk away." Daniel looked down at his hands, turning them slightly as if seeing them for the first time, the small cuts, the stiffness, the lingering tremor, and he shook his head once, almost instinctively. "I just did what I should have done a long time ago," he replied, his voice low, but there was something different in it now, something lighter, as if the weight he had carried had shifted, not gone, but no longer crushing. Rex lifted his head at the sound, his eyes moving between them, calm and steady, and Walter followed that movement again, studying the dog with a quiet intensity, as if piecing together something he had not fully seen before. And outside, the first faint outline of the world began to return, shapes emerging beneath the thinning veil of snow, the storm no longer hiding everything. And inside, the air felt different, not just warmer, but clearer, as if something had been set right in a way that could not be measured. And as the lights slowly grew, filling the small cabin with the promise of a new day, none of them spoke for a while. Because some moments are not meant to be filled with words, they are meant to be felt, held, and remembered long after the fire burns out. By the time the storm fully loosened its grip, the town had already begun to stir, slow at first, cautious, as if unsure whether the night had truly passed or was simply catching its breath. Snowdrifts lined the streets in uneven ridges, some reaching as high as 3 feet, burying cars, fences, and familiar landmarks beneath a quiet, blinding white. And word traveled the way it always did in small places, not through announcements or headlines, but through voices, through neighbors checking on neighbors, through the simple act of asking, "Did you make it through?" Until someone mentioned the Collins couple, their car found half buried along the northern pass, empty, doors open, and for a moment the town held its breath, because everyone knew what that usually meant, until another voice, quieter but certain, said they had been seen, walking, alive, heading toward the old cabin at the edge of town. And that was how the story began to move, not as a miracle, not yet, but as something people needed to see for themselves. By mid-morning, a small group had gathered outside Daniel's cabin, boots crunching against packed snow, breaths visible in the cold air, no one knocking right away, as if unsure whether they were intruding on something private, something sacred, until the door opened slowly from the inside. Daniel standing there, tired but steady, Rex at his side, the dog's posture calm but watchful, and behind them, Walter and Margaret seated near the fire, wrapped in blankets, but very much alive. The silence that followed was not shock in the loud sense. It was quieter than that, heavier, the kind that settles when people realize they were wrong about something or someone. A man from town stepped forward first, removing his hat, his voice low. We thought. He did not finish the sentence, because he did not need to. Daniel simply nodded once, understanding what had not been said, and for a moment no one spoke. They just looked, at the couple, at the cabin, at the man they had passed 100 times without really seeing. And then Walter stood, slower now but steady, his hand resting briefly on Margaret's shoulder before he took a step forward, his gaze moving across the small crowd, then settling on Daniel. This man, he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness, did not save us because anyone was watching. The words hung in the cold air, simple but undeniable. He walked into a storm that would have taken all of us, and he did it without asking who we were, or what we could give in return. The crowd shifted slightly, something in their expressions changing, not just respect, but something closer to recognition. Walter reached into the pocket of his coat, his hand moving with care, and when he brought it out, it was not money, not something easily measured, but a small set of keys, worn, solid. He held them out, not with ceremony, but with intention. I have spent years building things in this town, he continued. Places people rely on, places that matter, but none of it means anything if the right people are not standing in them. Daniel looked at the keys, then back at Walter, confusion flickering briefly before something else took its place, something quieter, more cautious. Walter stepped closer, placing the keys gently into Daniel's hand. There is an old building on Main Street, he said. It has been empty for a long time. I was waiting for a reason to decide what it should become. His eyes shifted briefly to Rex, then back again. Now I know. Daniel's fingers closed slowly around the keys, not out of instinct, but out of understanding that this was not just a gift. It was a turning point, something that reached beyond that single night, beyond the storm, and into a future he had not allowed himself to imagine. The crowd stood quietly. No applause, no noise, just the shared awareness that something had changed, not just for Daniel, but for all of them. And Rex stepped forward then, pressing lightly against Daniel's leg, grounding him in the moment, as the wind moved softly through the town, no longer a force to fear, but a reminder of what had been faced, and what had been carried through. And in that quiet, unspoken space, something settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the steady certainty of truth, that sometimes the smallest act of mercy does not just save a life. It changes the way an entire town sees what a life is worth.